Hello, warm winter greetings, depending upon from where you're tuning in. This is Policy for Normal People. I'm your host, Christy Amada. The legal immigration system. We're going to be talking about a far less publicized area of the immigration system, but no less important. While we know that, understandably, there's a lot of focus in the nation right now towards the illegal immigration system, we're going to talk today about the legal system because there are current policies being proposed and put forth, very important ones, that are going to make significant changes to the current immigration system. And there's no one I can think of better to join me today to talk about this than a very seasoned veteran in this policy issue, Chris Chmielenski, the president of the Immigration Accountability Project based in Washington, D.C. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, you and I have known each other for quite a few years, worked together, albeit in different roles in immigration policy in the past. But you are a far more seasoned veteran than I. And as a person who's moved on to other things such as starting my own business here recently, I do try to follow the issue as much as I can. But I created this podcast for people like myself who care about what's going on in our nation, regardless of the policy topic, but like to get with experts like you from time to time to sort of break things down for those of us who are either chasing children and spending our time working multiple shifts or doing other things and not able to dig in as deeply. So really appreciate you being here with us. I'm very eager to get into the legislative proposals. I know that the Pause Act, I believe it is, the Save Act are two that we're going to talk about today with significant changes involved in those. So looking forward to that. But before we do, let's hear a little bit about the Immigration Accountability Project, your organization, its mission, and what you're aiming to do.
Yeah, so we started the group back in 2023. I myself have been working on the issue since 2008, so almost 20 years. About a third of my life, I've been working on the immigration issue. Co-founded the organization with another woman by the name of Rosemary Jinks. She's been working on the issue for about 35 years now, so she's a longtime veteran. Harvard-trained lawyer, tons of experience, and pretty much has the federal immigration code memorized. So great asset, great resource, great friend to have. And we decided to start the group just because we felt that nobody was doing a good enough job of adequately holding members of Congress accountable. And that's essentially where our name comes from, the Immigration Accountability Project. We come at it, we're much more wonky. We take a wonky approach to it. So that can be good and bad, depending on how you look at it. You know, we as the group fully understands immigration policy, federal immigration policy, and how the proposed policies would impact our current immigration system. So that's the sort of thing that we look at and analyze and just try to educate Americans on it, as well as where all of their members of Congress stand on it as well. In addition to administration officials, too, we have an administration actions tracking tool as well on our website. So we track all of these actions, make it very publicly available to the people so they themselves can help hold members accountable. And then our sister organization, we have a sister organization, IAP Action, which is a 501c4. That's more of the actions lobby arm of our organization or of our family of organizations. And what IAP Action does is they actually rank members of Congress based on the actions that they've taken. And it's a little bit different from other systems that are out there. Typically, you see grade cards or key score voting, things like that. What we actually do is tally up the number of actions that individuals take on the issue of immigration and then just provide a ranking. So you know who in the House of Representatives and who in the United States Senate is doing the most of fighting for what we consider to be an immigration policy that serves the national interest.
That's fantastic. And thanks so much for letting our viewers and listeners know that you take that extra step to really educate people in a way that connects what Congress is actually doing in terms of voting. Because, there's a lot of rhetoric out there. People can say whatever they want to say, but there's nothing that holds the feet to the fire, I guess, than a vote, right?
Right. That's the ultimate action. The three ultimate actions are co-sponsoring legislation, sponsoring legislation, and then actually voting for it. We've heard a lot of rhetoric, especially in recent days, over the issue of immigration with some of the enforcement news that's been coming out. So you hear a lot of it, but Votes and actions don't necessarily match those statements. So that's really what we're trying to separate out. You'll go through not so much in the present time, but you go back in the past, you'll hear members of Congress that sound fantastic on immigration, depending on which side of the issue that they stand on. But then if you look at their voting record and what bills they co-sponsor and what bills they've introduced, it often tells a very different story. So that's why we like to approach it from that perspective. What actions are they actually doing? What are they actually doing to try to impact our immigration system? Not just what are they saying, because words can be just meaningless at times.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And it often can be very, surface compared to, talking about it from an impact or consequence standpoint.
Correct.
So yeah, that's true. I think for all policymaking, there's a little bit
Absolutely.
of you don't get a lot in a soundbite. So let's. I'm going to kind of work backwards a little bit. I know I mentioned those two acts, and I definitely want to jump into that. But we have a minibus in the Senate, correct? Tell us
We
what a
do. We
minibus
do.
is. I keep hearing all these words, an omnibus and, minibus. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, even having worked in this issue for a while, what that even means. Maybe you can tell people real quickly what that is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I tend to approach things from a more wonky perspective. So I might get a little
That's
technical
okay.
here. But, essentially, if you break it down and look at the US Constitution, it is Congress holds the purse strings. So the executive branch, the president of the United States, is responsible for executing the nation's laws and administering its various agencies. But ultimately, it comes down to Congress. Congress has to fund those agencies in order for those agencies to not only exist, but for them to do what they do. So Congress needs to pass about a dozen spending bills every single year. The federal fiscal year starts on October 1st and runs through September 30th. We have not had a normal appropriations process. And what I mean by that is Congress passing every single one of the appropriations bills. For example, there's a separate appropriations bill to fund the Department of Defense. There's a separate funding bill to fund the Department of Labor. There's a separate bill to fund the Department of Homeland Security. We haven't had a normal appropriations process in probably about 20 years. For the most part, our federal government has been funded through what's called either an omnibus, which is just a massive spending bill that just funds every aspect of the federal government, or through a continuing resolution. And what that does is that just simply continues existing funding levels for a certain period of time. We're actually operating under a continuing resolution right now. So Congress passed a continuing resolution right around Thanksgiving, which is what ended the month-long government shutdown that we had. And that continuing resolution ends on January 30th. So Congress needs to take action. They actually have. For the first time in a really long time, they're trying to return to some sort of normalcy when it comes to funding. And they have passed bills to fund most agencies within the federal government. So even if they don't pass this next bill, this minibus, as we've talked about, if they don't pass the minibus, we're not going to have a full-blown government shutdown like we did a couple of months ago. We're only going to have a partial government shutdown. Now, having said that, there's some pretty big agencies that are included in this minibus. And what a
I was about to
minibus
ask.
simply means, right, is that they have combined multiple spending bills for multiple agencies into one bill. And they do that for mostly political reasons. In
Shocker.
this particular minibus, yes, the big ones that are included in this minibus are the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Labor and the Department of Transportation. And then there's a couple others that are included in it as well. So you can see what's happening here. There's bipartisan interest in making sure that the Pentagon and Department of Defense stays funded. The Department of Labor and to a certain extent, the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation is pretty bipartisan as well. But when you get into the Department of Labor, that tends to be more favored by Democrats. So that's one of the reasons why the Republican leadership in Congress lumped it into this bill. And then they threw in the more controversial Department of Homeland Security funding bill. This bill was a little less controversial until the events this past weekend in Minneapolis. And then it became more controversial. As of right now, Democrats and just to step back for a second, this package was passed separately, but then completely united in the United States House of Representatives. and sent to the Senate as one giant package. So if the Senate wants to pass it, they have to pass it collectively. They have to pass all of these bills together. Since the weekend, you have a number of Democrats, including the Senate leader, Chuck Schumer, who's calling for the separation of the Department of Homeland Security bill from the rest of the package. Essentially, Democrats are saying, we want to fund DOD, we want to fund labor, we want to fund transportation. We're not going to fund DHS right now until we can put some restrictions on immigration enforcement.
And isn't it true that before the events, very recent events in Minneapolis, that at least 7 Democrats were going to support the full bill, including DHS? Is that correct? And
It would have passed without, right. If nothing, if the
sure,
events in
sure.
Minneapolis hadn't happened this weekend, it would have passed.
But it was
This would
interesting to
be
note that. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, and I wouldn't even be surprised. There's some interesting rules in the Senate. They have all these timelines that they have to abide by. Legislation has to sit on the floor for a certain period of time. You have to have a certain amount of debate. Democrats were even willing to waive some of that time to get the bill passed even sooner, just to make sure that funding was in place and nothing happened by the deadline at the end of this week to approve federal funding. So there was no controversy until this weekend. Yes, I still think the majority of Democrats would have voted against the bill simply because of the inclusion of the Department of Homeland Security funding bill as part of this minibus package. But there would have been enough Democrats to get them the 60 votes in the Senate that they needed to get the bill across the finish line. Now it doesn't look like we necessarily have those votes anymore. And there might even be a few Republicans who are on the fence. But I think if they put the package on the floor in its current state without any changes, exactly the way that it was passed by the House, I still think every Republican, maybe there would be one or two that wouldn't vote for it, but you would get most Republicans to vote for it. You're probably going to get a couple of swing state Democrats to vote for it as well. John Fetterman from Pennsylvania has indicated that he's going to support it regardless, even though he doesn't support funding DHS without some restrictions on immigration enforcement. But he's, again, shutting down any agencies within the federal government. So he wants to get this bill across the finish line. There might be others. I think that's still what they're trying to feel out, is how many votes they actually do have for it. Senate leadership on the Republican side, who controls the Senate, seems to be standing strong and saying, no, we're not going to split the package. There have been some conversations about adding some limitations to immigration enforcement. How they go about doing that is still under debate. The White House's preference and Senate Republican leadership's preference would be to do it in a separate bill. So what you do is you pass this mini as is, and then you do a separate bill that addresses some of the concerns that some more of the moderate Democrats have, that they know they can also get enough Republicans to support that it'll get across the finish line. The problem with doing that is then it goes back to the House of Representatives and you're unsure whether or not the House of Representatives will actually support it. So, or even bring it to the floor for that matter.
Right.
So Democrat leadership in the Senate is pushing for those changes to be included in the DHS spending bill. So that's where a partial government shutdown comes into place, because if that's the avenue that they take and they actually do amend the current bill as it stands, because it's been changed, it will have to go back to the House of Representatives for their passage. Now, the House doesn't have the kind of time restrictions that the Senate has, so the House could just come back on, let's say the Senate were to pass this thing on Thursday, the House could come back on Friday and have this thing passed into the president's desk and signed into law before a shutdown occurred. And because the shutdown, or the timing, the funding expiration lands during a weekend, essentially, there's even a day or two that they have to play with here to get the government back up and funded, or at least these agencies back up and funded. So there's some time there if they decide to go that route. I'm not sure what they're going to do. I mean, as of right now, nobody knows. As of this morning, it was still, yeah. And I get a couple of different newsletters, and even the ones that are more center, or even you would consider them to be center left, they're saying two separate things. I've got one of them saying that Republicans and Democrats in the Senate are talking to each other, and there seems to be room for compromise. And then another one's like, there's no room for compromise here. Democrats are sticking their foot down. So I think in the end, Senate Republicans are at least going to force Democrats to vote against funding the Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Department of Labor, and some of these other smaller agencies. And if they want to oppose DHS funding and somewhat force the threat of a partial government shutdown that includes the Department of Defense, if not actually initiate one. But, I think we'll ultimately get a deal here. It's just, this comes down to how can both sides at this point in time save face? How can Republicans pass something that doesn't look like they're softening on immigration enforcement? And on the flip side, how can Democrats sign on to something that they can then go back and sell to their base as, look at what we did? So
Yeah.
they can both try to, that's ultimately what's going to happen, is they're both going to try to figure out a way to get a win here. I don't necessarily see a prolonged shutdown, even if we have one, but you never know. I never would have guessed that the last one would have gone 6 weeks or
I
however
don't
long it
think
went.
any of us would. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. All of what you just described and the complexities of it and the machinations of politics are exactly why I'm more interested in what actually lands once we get policies in place, because that's what impacts people. I mean, for
exactly.
all the back and forth and all. And I know some of it's easy to say, well, Congress just needs to behave better, but it is complicated. I mean, these negotiations and it's people. I think people do genuinely care about their constituencies. There's games being played and political careerists, of course. I think we all see that. But yeah, thanks for just sort of explaining that and really in detail. That's really appreciated. Because it's just not something we're going to hear, in a news
Right.
soundbite or it's just too complicated, too much. Well, we'll see what happens. Let's hope we don't have a shutdown. That of course affects people and their livelihoods and a whole lot of things, and shuts down government operations in a way that's detrimental to people downstream. That sometimes it takes a while to even have the impact. So we saw it
Right.
before.
Right.
Yeah.
The ironic part of this is that Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers and Border Patrol agents are essential employees. So if the government shuts down, they're still going to show up to work.
Mm,
Still work, and they'll just get their back pay after the fact. And deep down, I think Democrats know that, so they know their hands are somewhat tied here. Maybe if it was a different administration, they would completely shut it down, but it's not going to happen. And obviously, you can't have, from a national security standpoint, you can't have Border Patrol just lay down. But also what's at play here too is the Department of Homeland Security includes a lot more than just immigration enforcement. You're
very
also
true.
talking about Coast Guard. You're talking about FEMA. You've got half the country is still digging out from a massive blizzard and ice storm that crossed the country. You got
My
millions of
car is
people,
still
or a
buried.
million. Yeah, you got a million people still without power, and we're talking about another nor'easter possibly hitting the eastern seaboard this weekend
That's a good point.
that
I mean, a
could
lot of
dump
people do forget
additional
about.
snow.
Yeah, absolutely. People forget about, the DHS covers a wide swath of responsibilities way beyond immigration. That's where the
Right,
visibility and
right.
highlight is. But you're right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a post 9/11 creation, correct? Agency creation.
It was, yes. So prior to that, immigration fell under the Department of Justice for the most part. And there's still a role of DOJ, and there's also a role that the State Department has. State Department issues all the visas, for example.
Hmm.
So there's multi-agency, but the actual enforcement aspect to immigration policy is under the Department of Homeland Security, which is why it's aptly named the Department of Homeland Security. It was a recognition of the 9/11 Commission that immigration actually does play a role in national security.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that regardless of what side a person is on in the current events, just that immigration does play a huge role in national security and I think that sometimes can get forgotten
Hmm.
in the emotions of everything. So let's get into these two acts. I've done a little bit of reading, about the Save and Pause Act, but I know you're going to be able to clarify for us more concisely just what kind of changes are being made there, what and why, what the rationale is behind those who are sponsoring or co-sponsoring or bringing these bills forth. So let's just get right into that. Which one would you like to start with, save or
Well,
pause?
let's start with the Save Act, because that's the quicker discussion, and the Pause Act is the obviously the much more comprehensive bill and gets into so many other areas.
Okay. Okay.
But
Sounds good.
the SAVE Act is pretty simple. In essence, it would require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote. Some people may say, well, isn't that already the case?
I was going to stop you just
It's not.
briefly because I know I have to
Yeah.
present when I go vote. I have to present my ID, right? My real ID and all that.
Depending
So
on which state you're in. Right, right,
yeah, so there are people out there I know who have said this is unnecessary because we already do it. So can you
right.
explain for us why maybe that is or isn't the case?
Sure. And you bring up something that I absolutely want to hit on. But we'll start with the fact that first there is so when
It's a lot.
So, yeah, I'm just trying to think of the best way to begin to explain it. But, every election, whether it's a midterm or whether it's a massive presidential election, there's always controversy over whether or not people who are not supposed to be voting are voting. Both political parties spend tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on attorneys and poll watchers and strategies and data crunching and everything to try to oversee the election process and to ensure that only people who should be voting are actually voting.
And to be
So,
clear, that includes, I mean, even green card holders with respect to immigration, they can't vote either or shouldn't be, right? We're not
correct.
just talking about people who are illegally present in the country.
In federal elections, you have to be a US citizen in order to cast a vote. But you have many states and municipalities that allow not just legal permanent residents, green card holders, people that are on a quote unquote path to citizenship, and people who are in the country without authorization, illegal aliens, to also vote in elections. New York City is a great example. Chicago, a lot of your big cities have passed some sort of a law that allows them to participate in local elections. They view them as part of their community and they say you should have a say in who the next school board chairman is.
Really? So there's actually laws passed that are
Yeah,
permitting that.
in some cities and
That's
towns,
news to
right?
me.
But they are not allowed to vote in a federal election. What's really exacerbated the problem here is that Congress did pass a law way back when in the 90s that I'll just simply call the motor voter law. People are probably familiar with that term, but essentially I recently moved to a new state. When you go and you get your driver's license in that state, depending on what state you're in, they either ask you, do you want to be registered to vote, or they just automatically register you to vote. We
Experience that
have even
too.
seen in some states, not only do they automatically register you to vote, but when you actually sign the form, the online version of the form, they've already checked the box attesting to the fact that you are a US citizen without actually checking US citizenship or
Really?
citizenship status. So we've seen from a number of states, and actually it's not just red states we've seen in purple states and maybe a blue state have looked into their voter rolls, and they've actually found individuals who are on their voter rolls that are not supposed to be there because they're not US citizens. So they've had to remove them from their lists. The SAVE Act would essentially throw up that firewall and say, as for now, it's not impacting anybody who's currently registered to vote, although there is a provision that might have an impact in the bill that might have an impact on those that are currently registered. But essentially what it would do is it would say, okay, going forward, when you register to vote, you have to show proof of citizenship. And you brought in a real ID driver's license, the idea of a real ID driver's license. And I just want a great item to bring up to highlight. It's the fact that what a real ID driver's license indicates is that it has been verified that the person in that photo and the name match, and you are the rightful owner to that document. It does not actually decide whether or not, or it does not differentiate between citizens and non-citizens. So if you're here on a green card, legal permanent resident status, or you're here on one of the extended guest worker programs, H-1B, for example, which can be for 3 or 6 years if you're renewed, or
Yeah.
even longer than that under
Yeah.
certain
It gets extended a lot.
policies. Yeah. you can get a driver's license and you can get a real ID driver's license. Now, most of the exclusions in states is to exclude illegal aliens from the states that do give driver's licenses to illegal aliens, to exclude them from getting real ID driver's licenses. But for anybody who's a foreign citizen who's in the country legally for an extended period of time and is eligible to get a driver's license, they can get a real ID driver's license. So that doesn't necessarily prove U.S. citizenship. The two primary documents that prove U.S. citizenship are going to be your birth certificate, a passport. Not even a social security number proves U.S. citizenship. So those are the two primary documents. That tends to be where the pushback comes from. But if you know what town you were born in, it's pretty easy to get your birth certificate. And you need these items to get real ID driver's licenses. Passport's a little bit of the higher bar. I understand not everybody has a passport or has interest in getting a passport, but everybody's got a birth certificate. And every town, city, state, county, whatever municipality, whatever type of municipality you happen to be born in that issued your birth certificate, they keep that record forever and ever and ever. So you can get that. It's just a matter of going through the process of getting it. It's pretty quick. And to me, that's a pretty low bar to have met, to have the privilege of voting in U.S. federal elections. I think it's a privilege to vote in U.S. elections. I think we should treat it that way rather than just say, we'll register everybody who happens to be physically present in the United States and we'll figure it out later if they can actually vote, if they're actually authorized to vote or not, legally authorized to vote or not. So that's the SAVE Act in a nutshell. It's passed through the House of Representatives. It passed with bipartisan support in the House of Representatives last summer.
Okay.
If you look at polling, about 80 to 90% of Americans support a citizenship requirement. So, and that's asking the question from a neutral perspective, just simply saying, do you think you should provide proof of U.S. citizenship to vote in U.S. elections? 80% to 90% of Americans agree with that statement, say yes, they should. So it does have bipartisan support. We don't know why. Well, we know why, but hasn't come to the Senate floor for a vote yet.
Mm-hmm.
Even though President Trump has urged passage of it, the Senate's still sitting on their hands, and that's where we're stuck at, and trying to continue to urge them to get it passed. But obviously, the Senate has a bigger roadblock in front of them this week.
I know that some of the pushback has been related to people saying, that this is going to negatively affect marginalized communities and minorities. But I know when I went to get my license, when I moved to Virginia from West Virginia, I had to redo all of that, of course, as we all do. And the requirements much more strict than they used to be, something not even related to immigration, as far as I know. Just simply, I had to show, because I had been divorced, remarried, and, you got to show your path through, how you went through that too. It isn't just your birth certificate. So,
Right.
to get that documentation. So that's everybody who has to do that. And that's just about what the path is that your life has taken. And you've got to show how that path has gone, because you have name changes, things like that go on, or you choose not to change your name, but you still have a marital status change. Whatever it is, I had to do all of that to get that real ID and get things updated when I moved, especially when I moved to a different state. And I did have to do a little work to go, to the town where I was born, because I hadn't been there and didn't grow up in that town. Incidentally, that was where the hospital was, and I came from a remote part of West Virginia. So I do know from personal experience that the charge of disenfranchisement, I think maybe a little bit misunderstood by some, even well-intentioned people, about what that actually means, because we're already going through lots of processes, paperwork, regulations, new real rules, even at the state level, in order to be properly documented for just about anything, whether it's driving or whatever.
Yeah, most of the people that the opponents of this legislation point to, we're talking about people that are most likely going to be receiving federal benefits or state benefits. Whether or not they have a driver's license, I'm not sure. Yeah, they may not be flying, but if they're married, these are all cases where you need those documents. I don't think anybody would push back if a state says, okay, we're going to, well, they might, but depending on which state or municipality you're in. But I think your point is a strong one, is that regardless of who you are or what your particular situation is in the United States, the kinds of documents that you need to prove U.S. citizenship, you need them for other stuff. So,
Absolutely.
and if you're, I don't know, it seems to me that it's just an excuse of why to oppose the legislation. They just simply don't want the extra barrier put up. That's what I believe it comes down to, is that they just want to make the process as open as possible. And if there's fraud, there's fraud.
Well, we know there is fraud in the legal immigration system already in various ways. I've had interesting conversations with, for example, ex foreign service officers that maybe felt a little more free to speak about it since they were retired, but they saw it even at the consular level where they were processing visas and things. Also, I
Hmm.
mean, there's and it's a good segue, what we're just talking about employment, or kind of getting into that, having to show documentation. I mean, I've yet to fill out a job application where you don't get asked if you're a US citizen and you got to check that box, or
Exactly.
provide documentation. So the
Right.
pause act, I know that we're running up against some time limits here, but I wanted to hit it at least briefly because there are two things about it in particular that I've continued to find complicated, and I think there's a lot of controversy around the especially H-1Bs, but we have an alphabet soup of visas. I don't think a lot of people realize just how many letters of the alphabet cover any type of visa, and a lot of times those are, we've heard the term chain migration with, you bring one person in, maybe a sponsorship for employment, but then how many other people from the family can come? And I know that the pact is maybe trying to address that. Is that
It is. This is a different approach. So, for most of my career, I've been fighting for reforms in the legal immigration system. And just for those that don't know, the big picture aspect to this is that about 2/3 of all green cards issued to the United States are given to people who are family members of people who are already here. We bring in about 1.1 million new people every single year. About 600,000 to 700,000 of those go to actually extended family members, which we refer to as chain migration. So a new immigrant comes to the United States because they get a job and get sponsored for a green card by, let's say, Apple Computers. Once they're here, they can sponsor their spouse and their minor children, but it goes beyond that. Once they obtain citizenship, they can then sponsor their parents, and they can sponsor their adult brothers and sisters. And of course, they can then sponsor their spouses and minor children and their in laws. And it creates this endless chain of family based migration. And we don't necessarily think, or I don't believe, that that serves the national interest. I think the United States should be, you often hear people who are pro immigration, which I am too. You hear people who say that they're pro immigration. Well, we need to be bringing in the best and the brightest. And I agree with that 100%. This is not bringing in the best and the brightest. This is just bringing in people because they know somebody. And we've seen heavy reliance from these individuals on federal welfare benefits, state and local welfare benefits, fraud, which we've touched upon. These can be future podcasts for you if you want to dig into all of these.
Yeah, I'm sure it sounds very, very complex.
Yeah. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's essentially three parts that make up our permanent legal immigration system. You have chain migration, which I just discussed. Then you have the workplace, you have the employment sponsored green cards, which actually makes up a smaller, much smaller percentage. There's only about 130 or 150,000 of those, I think it is. I should know the number off the top of my head, but it's escaping me right now. And then you have something else that's called the visa lottery. And the visa lottery is just a random lottery. We just raffle off 55,000 green cards to anybody across the world who files an application for it.
Was that something going all the way back to the 60s? They also called it diversity a lottery or something too. Is that the same
The
thing?
diversity visa lottery, yeah.
Yeah.
That started with the Immigration Act of 1990. Chain migration
Okay.
dates
Okay.
all the way back to the Immigration Act of 1965, but it was drastically expanded during the Immigration Act of 1990. What ended up happening was, and what really caused our immigration numbers to explode, our annual immigration numbers to explode, was they introduced the concept of family-based / chain migration with the Immigration Act of 1965, but there were still caps to it. And then in the 1990 bill, they lifted the caps on parents. And that really exploded the system, because then if you're bringing in an unlimited number of parents, the parents can then sponsor That's when you start getting into aunts and uncles and cousins and everything else, where it really extends outside of just that nuclear family. So the diversity visa lottery has existed since around 1990. So we've tried to, over my career, the groups that I've worked with and the groups that we're still affiliated with have fought to try to address each one of these individually. Essentially eliminate chain migration, eliminate the birthright citizen, or eliminate the visa lottery, reform the way that we give out employment-based green cards, and then also eliminate something that's called birthright citizenship, which is just the automatic granting of U.S. citizenship to every child born in the United States, regardless of the status of their parents. So we tried to address each one of these issues individually. Well, the first time we tried to deal with the issue on a collective basis was through the RAISE Act, which was introduced about 6 years ago. Hasn't really, it's been introduced in the House, but not in the Senate. A couple of times since then, but it's definitely lost its shine since 2017 when there was a lot of talk about the RAISE Act. The RAISE Act would eliminate chain migration, eliminate the visa lottery, and also end the current employment preference legal immigration system and replace it with a merit-based system where it's all points-based. So you get a certain number of points for whether or not you have a doctorate degree or a master's degree or you're a subject matter expert, things like that. There were ways to obtain points, and then essentially green cards were just issued to the people that receive the highest number of points.
And isn't the merit system pretty popular in other countries? I mean, aren't there a lot of other countries that do something similar?
There are most of the big ones. I mean, this is how Great Britain gives out green cards. This is how Canada, Australia, some of the more, when you compare the immigration system in the United States, again, we allow in through our green card process about 1.1 million new immigrants every single year. When you compare that to other countries, it's massive. In Canada, they let in maybe a couple 100,000. Same thing with Australia. Great Britain, it's, maybe 100,000 at that. So
how did it get so big? I mean, how did this this annual number get so big? That's probably a big question in and of itself, but
yeah, it really exploded again, going back to this concept of chain migration. That's what really blew it up. But, the approach over the last 24, 25 years hasn't been just to knock out chain migration, but also knock out some of the other things that are included in the legal immigration system, like the diversity visa lottery, which there's really no purpose, nor does it serve the national interest. It just makes people feel good. So if we're giving green cards to countries it goes to countries who are underrepresented through the other categories. So it's making sure that we're having lots of people from around the world coming in, not just people from one particular country or two particular countries coming in.
So the final thing I'd like to talk to you about in relation to all of that, and please, if you've got additional things to add to that, feel free. I did want to hit on, before we close today, the optional, I think it's called OPT for short, optional practical training program. Hopefully I got that right. And I know that is sort of I have a vague understanding of that in terms of how it allows people to kind of stay longer, I guess. And same thing with H-1Bs, because those are employment sponsored, like employer sponsored visas, right? So, is that competing with people already here, both immigrants, legal permanent immigrants, as well as native born citizens? Is that a concern that your organization has?
Yes. And they're directly competing with Americans for jobs. And that's all under the umbrella of the PAUSE Act. So the approach of the PAUSE Act, just quickly to wrap up on that before I get into H-1Bs and OPT, the purpose of the PAUSE Act is it's just simply a different approach. It's not saying, okay, well, we tried addressing each one of these programs individually. We tried doing it and replacing it with a merit-based system. Now let's try another approach. Let's just say we're going to pause all immigration until these things are done. So it's sort of lighting a fire under Congress's tush to reform the immigration system.
Is there a timeline of that? How long that pause would last if it was passed?
So until Congress, now it automatically ends the visa lottery, ends birthright citizenship, also ends chain migration and passes a new immigration law, pauses everything. And when I say everything, the only thing that it doesn't pause is tourist visas. So Disney World will still get its business, but everything else stopped. It's just halted.
Now, I guess the birthright citizenship is going to get challenged probably from a constitutional standpoint, right? I know we've heard
Right,
a lot.
right, and it looks like the Supreme Court's gonna address the constitutional issue with birthright citizenship. Now, the bill also, as you brought about, it ends the OPT program, which is the optional practical training program, and ends onshore adjustments for H-1Bs. So I'll start with OPT because that one's a little bit easier to explain. The optional practical training program is essentially a program that was created out of thin air by the second Bush administration that allows foreign students to stay and work in the United States for a certain period of time once they graduate from a US college or university. So foreign students come to the United States under the F1 visa. And when they sign the paperwork and accept an F1 visa, they actually say that my intent, you have to declare that your intent is to leave the United States after you graduate, and that your sole reason for coming to the United States is to get an education. And ultimately, we want these folks to go back to their countries and contribute to their countries, especially ones that are coming from lesser developed countries. We think it's a huge benefit that they can come here, get a high quality US education, and then maybe go back to their home countries and become leaders back in their home countries, in their industries. This actually encourages them to stay and contradicts what they actually sign when they receive their F1 visa by allowing them to stay and continue and to work here in the United States. Furthermore, creates direct competition for US born graduates of colleges and universities in those same fields. Now, it mostly affects optional training program it's restricted to STEM fields,
Okay.
except
I
so
was going to
science,
ask if it
technology,
affects all
engineering, and
sectors or
mathematics.
really. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but when you look at the laundry list of majors that it covers just about everything.
Okay. I
So
wondered
they
about
figured
that.
out a way to get everything, pretty much every major, except for maybe being an English major,
Mm,
under the heading of science, technology, engineering, of mathematics, even I think philosophy. That's a science.
wow. No, that's not in the
You can
STEM
throw that
part.
under.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it still falls under STEM, right? And there's advantages for employers in hiring these individuals. The biggest one that is of financial gain to them is that they're not subject to payroll taxes. So as an employer, that's 7.65% of added cost that you don't have to pay. So if you hire somebody at a salary of $100,000 a year, you have to pay $7,650 in payroll taxes above and beyond that to the federal government to cover their
Sure.
Social Security and Medicare
So it's clearly a
expenses.
disincentive to hire
Right,
native US born citizens.
right,
And
right.
I guess even immigrants that are naturalized as well as.
So that doesn't necessarily apply to that doesn't apply to legal permanent residents, and it doesn't apply to a lot of the guest workers that come into the United States. So they are actually subject to the payroll taxes, but opt isn't. I think the key thing to point out is opt was never created by Congress, and in fact, the law actually prohibits something like opt from happening. They say the whole purpose of an F1 visa is solely to come here and get a degree or to study at a US college or university. It is not for work. But Congress also threw in a loophole in the immigration code that gives the administration full discretion on who they can give work permits to. So that's what the Bush administration used. Program was expanded by the Obama administration. It was trimmed back a little bit by the first Trump administration. It's just kind of hung there ever since, but it still exists. And what we tend to see is that you come in as and this is the way too that colleges and universities are selling it too. You come to the United States on an F1 visa, you get a degree in computer engineering, for example. You can then continue to stay and work here. You get connected with a company. That company then sponsors you for an H1B visa, which I'll get into in a moment. You convert to an H1B visa, and then the H1B visa will sponsor you for an employment-based green card. And then, it might take 20 years for you to get your employment-based green card, but you can stay and work for us. And essentially, it's indentured servitude for the employer. That person cannot leave that employer because that employer has sponsored their H-1B visa and they've sponsored them for a green card. So that individual is tied to that company. The H-1B visa is simply a guest worker program for more skilled workers, although we often see it used for lesser skilled positions. Now, I don't say things like a lesser skilled position stocking shelves at Walmart or something like that.
Hmm.
No, I mean lesser skilled professional positions, so basic accounting. A lot of times what they're using it for, and the simple reason why is because when a U.S. citizen graduates from a college or university with a degree in accounting and gets their CPA license, and they're looking for their first job, they're looking for a salary of maybe $80,000 a year, which is
Sure.
going rate for an entry level accountant, where the foreign worker might be willing to work for 60,000. So it's
Mm.
just a way of undercutting US workers. So what the Pause Act would do is it would pause the H-1B visa until all of these issues, these larger issues, are addressed. But one of the issues that Congress has to address is it has to eliminate the onshore adjustment. What I mean by that is it eliminates, not only does it eliminate the OPT program, but it says if you are here in the United States on, let's say, a tourist visa, you can't adjust to H-1B status. You
Is
have to
that
leave the
possible
country.
now to adjust from a
It could
tourist
be
visa? Is that
possible. The tourist visa is maybe a bad example, but a business visa, visitor visa. So you could certainly work for an international company. You could work for Toyota, for example, which we know it's based in Japan, but has a massive presence here in the United States. You can come here from Japan as a Tokyo employee, as a business visitor, and then Toyota USA says, we're going to sponsor you for an H-1B because we don't want you to go back to Japan. We want you to stay here.
I see.
Now, that's a highly developed country with a high standard of living that's competitive with the United States. So that's a pretty bad example to use that one.
Hmm.
But that's essentially kind of the way that it would work, or that's the way that it does work. But it's more so used with this optional practical training path. So you have a student who goes college, gets their degree in computer engineering, they graduate, a tech company hires this individual out of college on an opt. Then they sponsor them for H-1B visa. Not only would the Pause Act eliminate the optional practical training program, but even if something similar were to be created afterwards, it would prevent them from converting from an optional practical training program to H-1B visa because you can't adjust your status while you're in the country. You have to leave the country to adjust your status. The Trump administration approved a federal regulation that increases the fees for H-1Bs, which is very helpful, but that's the reason why the Pause Act specifically addresses onshore status adjustments, because the increased fees that the Trump administration has implemented for the H-1B program only applies to out of country applicants. So it only applies to people who might be in India right now who's trying to come into the country on an H-1B. It doesn't include the people who are already here trying to adjust to an H-1B. They still pay the very, very low fees that are currently associated with that program.
Interesting. Yeah. I've seen reports, various places where I guess there's some back and forth. I mean, the Trump administration, so many times I've heard them say they want to increase, legal immigration and in various ways. The gold visa, which I know isn't the H-1B, that isn't that like
Yeah.
an M5 or something that's related to people who come in to start businesses in the country. I know that one can be controversial too. And I know we don't have time to cover it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like in general, though, what you're describing is what I'm taking away from it, and you can steer me back if I'm off course. There's so much focus on policies involving immigration. How do they affect, harm, hurt, help immigrants? And depending upon what side a person might be on with regard to the immigration policies and systems, you can sometimes either be demonized for it or you can be applauded. But really, it almost sounds to me like there needs to be more attention. I mean, I'm pro-immigration like you are. I have plenty of friends who, are hardworking immigrants who have come to this country. I'm sure that if you go back far enough, my poor Irish immigrant ancestors made their way here.
Right. Right. Mine
So
came from Italy.
there you go.
Yeah.
So, it to me, I think sometimes we get lost or we get sidetracked with where the focus should be. I mean, it feels like from what you described that employers need to be more of a target for, and the system is allowing them, even the way it's been put in place for so long, they're disincentivized to hire US born, and there's an almost anti-capitalist bent to this that is about the employment part of it, and really can harm both immigrants and US born, it sounds like. Am I missing anything in that interpretation?
No, there's no question that mass immigration, which is what we currently have, and I just want to point out we have limitations on our immigration system. So it's not a matter of so many times this debate boils down to anti-immigrant versus pro-immigrant. No, the debate is actually over the limits. How are we going to limit immigration? We have limits. Right now the limit is 1.1 million. There are some people that support 2.2 million or 3 million. I wouldn't necessarily call them open borders. Open borders is just no limitations whatsoever. And so far, I could be wrong on this, but I haven't seen legislation offered that would be true open borders. They still place some limits. I just support lower limits. That's what I'm in
And
favor of.
1.1 million is a lot in a
Right.
year's time when you go
Yeah.
back to what you said earlier, especially about the additional family sponsorships that right now are permissible. I mean, I have a question
Right.
about that if I can go back real quick. If I have been sponsored, let's say, to come over and work, and I've got a job as an immigrant, but my uncle comes later, is he required to have a job before he arrives? Is there rules on that?
If came in as a legal permanent resident and then obtained US citizenship, and you then sponsored the family members you could sponsor, and they sponsored the family members that they sponsored, and it ultimately met that the primary immigrant, the very, very first person that comes, uncle made their way here. No, they would be coming in through the family-based immigration system. They would not be coming in through employment-based. So there is no requirement for them to have a job. They simply have to sign an affidavit that simply says that they won't be a burden on taxpayers. Even
But who's going to say
the
no to that?
Right. And even the policies that we have in place don't necessarily exclude that. And the Center for Immigration Studies has done a number of deep dives into this and have found that when you look at native households compared to non-native households, yes, non-native households use significantly more welfare benefits than native households. So
And to
there does
clarify,
become a dependency.
CIS is not the same as USCIS, right? That's the government
Correct,
agency, but
correct.
then they're
Right.
a
They're an independent think tank. Yes.
okay, yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. One of the many that are out there, and they've just examined using census data. The census asks people very simply, are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? Were you born here? Were you not born here? And at the same time, they also ask them, do you use welfare benefits? Do you not use welfare benefits? So you're able to use the multitude of crosstabs, and they've been able to deduce, what percentage of native born households use welfare, what percentage of non-native households. And there's much more reliance of or I shouldn't say native. Well, yeah, it is native. It's US born versus foreign born is typically the way that they report that data. But that again, that's what I'm fighting for. That's what the Immigration Accountability Project is fighting for. We're fighting for an immigration system that doesn't hurt Americans who are currently here. And I've said it twice already. I'll say it again. It serves the national interest. We believe that immigration should benefit the United States, not hurt the United States, or even just be neutral. Because even if it's neutral at the time that it occurs, long term, it may become a net negative. Hey, it may become a net positive. But we just think, we think you can have a pretty strong immigration system and still have people coming to the United States if you simply focus on those that are going to make significant contributions to the U.S. and again serve in the national interest and not be a threat to our national security or public safety, or threaten American workers and their wages. You'll hear this. You'll hear it so often. No, we can't get rid of all of these individuals, especially the ones that are here illegally. Who's gonna build the houses and who's gonna pick our fruit? I mean, that's just somebody admitting, yeah, I think we need cheap labor because our labor laws aren't good enough. Because if
Right.
our labor laws if these employers were willing to pay the going rate
Mhm.
for an American worker to do that job, you probably would see American workers. And, just to add on top of that, right now we're looking at a situation where we might be heading into a jobs recession. The jobs numbers for the
Right.
really since last summer have been pretty dim.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
you know, We're talking about not necessarily adding new jobs to the economy, but we're going to continue to bring in 1.1 million people in 2026.
And a lot of the sponsored large companies, I think of Silicon Valley types or even Amazon, I mean, they have shed lots of workers, and that includes
Right.
a lot of these H-1Bs, right? So, their claim, and they're often
But they're
advocating
applying for more
for
H-1Bs.
more. Exactly. Yeah, I've heard. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to be following it every day to even see that. That's pretty
Yep.
obvious out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And even the H-2B, which is the lower skilled non-agricultural guest worker program, which is just, that's a very short term temporary program. Supposed to be 9 months, but it can be longer. Congress tried to increase it from 66,000 to 268,000 in 2026 in the DHS spending bill that's before the Senate right now. Thankfully, the House stripped that provision out, and they still increased it, but they increased it to 66,000, but that's still a far cry from 238,000. Again, yeah, you're talking about some again, just hitting on my point, there's been some dismal jobs reports over the last 7 or 8 months. Do we really need more workers coming into the country when even our own jobs data is telling us that we're not necessarily creating new jobs? And as you said, you've got people getting laid off, not just at these big tech companies, but you see I read a report yesterday that Red Robin is closing a bunch of restaurants. Macy's is about to close, I think, 17 stores across the country. So
And
these
certainly
are
federal
all
workers are part of that number, but it's
right,
not
right.
the largest number, actually, if I remember what I saw. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
it matters. I mean, it all matters if it
right,
matters to
right.
anybody. But yeah, we're in a time of transition and change in the market, across the board, and that certainly includes the jobs factor in it too. So yeah, well, thank you so much, Chris, for being here and for your generosity with your time, because I had promised you about 30 minutes, but we got into some great stuff, and I know we've run over an hour, but I I learned a lot. I hope that our listeners and viewers have learned a lot. If you want to learn more about the Immigration Accountability Project, go to IAP.org. Chris is the president of that organization.
IAproject.org.
A project. I knew I was going to mess it up. Sorry. Yeah,
Yep.
thanks. Immigration
IAproject.
Accountability. IAproject.org. Okay. And do check it out, where they certainly mean it when they say they are holding congressional members accountable for their votes, especially getting beyond the rhetoric. So, Chris, is there any last few words you'd like to add before we close?
Not too much. We've covered a lot. Thanks again for having me on and letting us introduce our group to your audience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your commitment to the country. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for tuning in. Please visit my YouTube channel, Christy Amada at Policy for Normal People, if you want to catch previous episodes. We're also available on Substack, Spotify, and Apple. And with that, we'll close. And again, Chris, just really appreciate your time. And thanks so much for breaking this all down for us. Have a wonderful week, and good luck with everything you're working on.
Same to you.
Thank you.